I have never seen a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, but that's going to change. I'm going to watch every single one and then review them in this video. And I'm going to post this whether I like them or not. So this video could end up being very controversial or very regular. Anything can happen. Before we jump in, I think I should establish the little that I do know about this franchise. Firstly, I know Jack Sparrow, played by Johnny Depp, is the main character. I can't quite define what I think his character's personality is, but I'm imagining somebody that's a bit esoteric, flamboyant, charismatic, confident, that sort of thing. I know that Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley are supporting characters, but I have no idea who they play. I know of a tentacle face man that I believe is the main villain, and I've seen that one cool shot where the guy is like walking down the stairs in slow-mo and the boat is blowing up around him. That's about it. Oh yeah, also that Lonely Island song.
I'm really sorry I'm late. I just got caught up watching the Pirates of the Caribbean marathon.
To be honest with you, I'm slightly regretting that I started this challenge, because this movie is meant to be the best one, but I didn't love it the way everybody else seems to. I still think there's a lot of good here though. First, the performances. Very fun. Johnny Depp is great, but I knew that would be the case going in. What surprised me was how cool the whole supporting cast is. Why is all the pirates talk Johnny Depp, Johnny Depp, Johnny Depp when we've got this guy? Also, this movie made me understand the Keira Knightley hype. I love the sets and costumes, as well as how seemingly all of the ship stuff was practically done. And I love the way it blends these period piece elements with grimy, spooky fantasy stuff. I was really surprised by how dark the movie got at points. And honestly, I think this movie could have used more freaky stuff. Those parts were my favorite. You can truly tell that this film was created by a director with a real unique vision, and I'm always a fan of that. Shout out to Gore Verbinski. I really think his directing is the unsung hero here, because I really felt the way he conveyed information visually in this film was masterful. Another thing that caught me by surprise was the fact that Jack Sparrow was kind of an anti-hero. I maybe should have guessed that because he is a pirate, but I just wasn't expecting that from the iconic lead of a Disney movie. I like how the film has these three factions, and instead of making who you should root for clear cut, the film just kind of observes the conflict between these groups. And that level of complexity and nuance is not what I expected from this movie. I love how often people flip-flop allegiances for personal gain, and oftentimes it isn't revealed why they chose to make the decisions they did until later. That probably makes these movies very rewatchable. Now that I've said what I liked, I think I'll get into why the rest of the movie didn't really connect with me. Firstly, it does feel a bit long. I know that's a little weird to hear because it is only 2 hours 20 minutes and I'm a guy who loves 3-hour movies, but honestly I feel like this film's story could have quite easily been told in under 2 hours, since I felt after a point the movie kept going in circles, like with the way Jack Sparrow was captured 3 separate times. That being said, this film is relatively well paced for the length that it is. It's very action packed and the story always has forward momentum. However, even though it is action packed, I don't always love the action. The majority of it is just characters shuffling up and down rooms clinking their swords together. There's no real progression and there's rarely a feeling of, oh no, Jack Sparrow's losing the scene right now, because nothing other than sword clinking ever happens. So everyone's on a level playing field and you know that nobody's going to die because everyone has plot armor. Furthermore, if the action was shot as well as the rest of the movie, I would maybe give it a pass, but I think it's filmed a little too conventionally. There are some cool moments, like how Barbossa turns into a skeleton every time he's in light during the final fight, or just a lot of the stuff that happens around the fighting, like that final death. But cool things like that don't make up for the fundamental flaws in these scenes for me. The last thing I didn't like too much was the humor. I thought it was a little corny and clunky, but it's not that big of a deal. I probably would have loved this film if I watched it for the first time when I was a bit younger, but as a withered and cynical 17-year-old, I just see it as pretty good. I would give it a strong 3.5 to a light 4. By the way, before this, I imagined the squid guy being a recurring villain in every movie, kind of like Voldemort, but he didn't seem to appear here, except by name. I know he's called David Jones now. So I'm assuming he'll be in number 2, and I'm expecting big things.
I love those moments. I like to wave at them as they pass by.
This is more like it. I don't get why people say 1 is the best when to me this one feels undeniably better. I totally understand that this movie gets a bit weird and a bit dumb, but I think leaning more into the fantasy stuff as well as being unapologetically goofy is the secret sauce that 1 was missing for me. I really like the way the set pieces in this movie spiral out of control and the way they manage to blend action with comedy. It very obviously has a lot of silent film influence, which I'm a big fan of. This whole movie is just super inventive, not just the action scenes. I love the world building here and the way they introduce real life urban legend and make it fit into the gothic horror aesthetic they have going on. Davy Jones and his whole crew have a wonderful look and the CGI is top tier. I'd say the only thing that surpasses it is Avatar 2, but that's obviously much more recent and expensive. This whole movie is just gorgeous. There's a couple rainy night scenes here that feature some of the most beautiful crisp lighting I've ever seen. The directing was already great in one, but I think it only improved here. Gore Verbinski is a guy who understands the potential of film as a visual medium. I mean, there's so many great examples here of imagery telling the story instead of just words and actions. This film isn't all sunshine and rainbows for me though. I will admit that it's a bit bloated. You can especially see this in the second act, where Keira Knightley, for example, gets a scene and then it has to cut away to all the other storylines, and then Keira Knightley only reappears like 40 minutes later because there's just that much going on at once. That reminds me, the first half of this movie needed way more Keira Knightley. Just like 1, I felt this film was a little longer than it needed to be, but I still think it paces itself well. And my final criticism is that I don't know how to feel about the love square they're setting up here. Jack Sparrow's inclusion feels odd. It's like that one scene in Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated where Daphne and Shaggy kiss. It's just like, get that off my screen. But the more I think about it, the more I like Sparrow and Elizabeth together. Just because this Norrington guy is so out of the picture, and Orlando Bloom is the safe, boring choice that you know is going to happen, why not make Elizabeth end up with Jack Sparrow? You know, they have chemistry, even though she killed him at the end. Speaking of that, I knew that 1 and 2 were being filmed at the same time, but I had no idea 2 had a to be continued type ending. When it was like 15 minutes away from the credits and they were still fighting the Kraken, Davy Jones nowhere to be found, I was like, okay, great. I was loving this movie and now they're gonna ruin it by just randomly cutting to black during a big exciting moment across the Spider-Verse style. But the film actually ended quite gracefully where I wasn't offended. The way Barbossa came in at the end was awesome. 4.5 out of 5. I'm glad Disney let him get weird with this one.
Now we're being followed by rocks.
Okay, they may have gone too far in a few places. This movie was allowed to get even weirder than the second, something I was surprised about but I liked. However, it did make me lose track of what was going on sometimes, which could just be because I'm an idiot, but either way it hurts the experience because this film is just so plot driven. You see this a lot in films that are like the end of a franchise. So much has been set up and so much has to be concluded in one movie that the film never stops to take a breather from its juggling act. My favorite parts of Dead Man's Chest were the silly set pieces and fun character moments, and both of those don't really exist here, or at least they're quite few and far between, because this movie is all, we have to go here to get this and we have to use her to open that for 3 straight hours. I get why it's like that, but I do think it hurts the movie. Alternatively though, while this movie's primary goal is concluding this trilogy, it does still manage to introduce some fun new stuff. I was a really big fan of that pirate politics scene. I thought it was a great bit of lore and world building. Also, it's awesome that they got Keith Richards in this. Strangely, it was only this movie that won me over on Jack Sparrow. I obviously was a fan of the uniqueness of the character and Johnny Depp's performance in the previous 2, but for some reason he just had a different bit of spice and magic to him in this film. Similarly, I love Davy Jones even more now, probably because his character was given a lot more humanity in this one, versus 2 where his whole purpose was just kind of being intimidating. Also, he's played by Bill Nye? What? If I had to give a top 3 favorite characters, I would say Elizabeth Swann, Davy Jones, and then Jack Sparrow. My favorite moment in this movie was Marty flying across the screen in that opening battle, and my least favorite moment was Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom ridiculously getting married mid-battle at the end of the movie. Just leave it out. This film gets a 3.5.
You are Jack Sparrow.
There should be a captain in there somewhere.
I think we can all agree this is where the fun of this challenge stops. To be honest, even though this movie didn't need to get made, I like a lot of the ideas in it, like the mermaids, Blackbeard, or the Fountain of Youth. Admittedly, these concepts are significantly more cliche and less inventive than those of the first trilogy, but it would have definitely been possible to make a good movie out of them. Unfortunately, they didn't. You see, the obvious thing to point your finger at for why this movie is bad is the lack of characters from the original trilogy. And yes, while that is an issue, I do kind of like the idea of abandoning everything from the first trilogy and trying to build a whole new trilogy with Jack Sparrow leading a whole new pirate crew. However, the characters they created to replace the greats from 1 through 3 kind of suck. All of them feel kind of like Guy, because they really don't feed much into the story's heart, and they lack a certain groundedness that Will and Elizabeth had. Don't get me wrong, Guy is great, but when every single character is just as or significantly more one note than him, the movie doesn't work, and Jack Sparrow has to carry it on his back, which he's struggling with because his shtick is feeling a little old and he's sort of gone Flanderized. This movie doesn't make any shocking, disgraceful decisions in my opinion, but it's just really boring, and I think the main issue is that the original director left, meaning that this movie has some of the driest cinematography and flattest lighting I've ever seen in a blockbuster. It feels like a cheap TV movie. And you know it's bad when the best scene of the film is the opening set piece, which in all honesty is quite a bit weaker than every action scene in 2 and 3. The only good part of this movie is this one joke that I laughed at.
I gotta go.
2 out of 5. Wait, What the hell? I just learned that On Stranger Tides is the 3rd most expensive movie of all time, adjusted for inflation. I thought World's End was the one that was that expensive. I mean, that movie actually feels expensive unlike this. Stranger Tides had a budget of $492 million. Okay, instantly, this went from mid and forgettable to just an embarrassment. Captain Jack Sparrow! This film just pretends like the 4th never existed, choosing to start this new era of Pirates movies from scratch. Whether that was a good decision or not could be argued, but it doesn't really matter since this soft reboot is just as bad as the previous one. The only nice things I have to say is that they managed to give some minor characters more development, which is always good, and this one is more visually interesting than Stranger Tides. But that isn't really saying much, and a lot of the camera movement here feels a little purposeless and gimmicky, versus the original trilogy where you could feel real control. The new characters here are just as flat as those of the 4th, only this time they lean more cliche and cringe than they do boring. Also, in all honesty, it took me like 90 minutes to realize this guy from 5 is not the same person as this guy from 4. I do actually quite like the visual concepts behind Salazar, but as a character he's just as forgettable as Blackbeard. In this film, the franchise's action has gone from silly silent film inspired visual gags to being flat out cartoons. And there's no more new Hans Zimmer music, so every music cue feels out of place. The story lacks any of the fun, secret motives or subtext of the original trilogy, and the jokes are genuinely some of the worst I've heard in a while. Basically, every second in this movie there's a new innuendo, and it is exhausting.
From this moment on, we are to be allies!
Considering where your left hand is, I'd say we're more than that.
We find the trident together. Do I have your word?
You're holding everything but my word.
Perhaps we can discuss this later, as I'm having trouble hoisting your port!
You are far from port, that is my stern.
This is without a doubt one of the unfunniest movies I've ever seen. 1.5 out of 5. Yeah, that was an interesting one. I do definitely appreciate the original trilogy, and I would without a doubt recommend it to anyone who hasn't seen it, and I would probably rewatch it in the future. However, if we're being a bit nitpicky, none of those films quite hit the spot for me, because 1 lacked some sauce, 2 was great but didn't feel fully formed since it was only the build-up, and then 3 lost me a bit. But this was still an enjoyable time nonetheless, as long as we ignore 4 and 5. It is actually insane how many huge movies were handed to visionary directors in the early 2000s. You definitely can't say that for nowadays, and I don't think we're grateful enough for what we had. Anyways, thanks for watching. Goodbye.